Please welcome Fabrice Houdar, Human Rights Officer, United Nations.
So this is part of a campaign that my office, the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, is running called Free and Equal. And it's a campaign which goal is to raise awareness on homophobia and transphobia globally. And usually we talk about human rights, but this particular video talked about the economic and business case. And it's actually interesting to see how in many places of the world, when the human rights argument doesn't really get you anywhere, the economic and business case argument is very powerful. And before I joined the Office of the High Commissioner, I worked for the World Bank for a long period of time. And at the end, I did that study that is mentioned in the video, which used India as a case study to say the obvious, which is that discriminating against LGBTI people is a gigantic self-inflicted economic wound. And that study was a little bit of a bullshit study. It was kind of a back-of-the-napkin calculation. It said, India is losing between $1 and $3 trillion, and $2 billion a year by not being inclusive of LGBTI people. And strangely enough, the study was picked up so many times. And what I feel is that if it is a culture war, as Sarah Kettelis kind of referred to earlier, then we have to use any argument that is available to us to achieve progress. And so the topic of my conversation today is going to be the global context on LGBTI issues, and then the role of the private sector. And the difference between Sarah Kettelis and Sarah Kate says that she's very optimistic. It's probably because she's an American, and I'm a Frenchman, so I'm extremely pessimistic. And so take my presentation as a grain of salt. Things might be better than I'm going to tell you. But first of all, look at that map. It's not looking too good, right? That map that ILGA produces every year shows how homosexuality remains criminalized in so many countries. And not only that, but as you know, there is still a small group of countries that punish homosexuality with death penalty. We have known tremendous progress. Actually, the commemoration of Stonewall 50 last year was really striking in terms of the progress we have achieved, unthinkable progress. However, we also are very conscious of the fact that the progress we have achieved has only benefited certain segments of the community. And if you look at issues of gender identity or issues of intersex people, they are actually still extremely problematic, even in countries like the United States and Europe. In fact, today I wrote a piece I'm going to the Women's Forum in Paris tomorrow, and I wrote a piece that said, are gay men at risk of being the honorary white of hegemonic masculinity? And it's a reference to Japanese people during apartheid in South Africa that actually were not the target of apartheid and therefore didn't fight apartheid in South Africa. And the idea there is that, gay men have created, particularly white gay men in urban areas in the US and Europe, have created a place for themselves under the sun and might be tempted to not fight for the rest of the community. One statistic that I love to give is that if you look at lesbians in business, you pretty much can count on two hands the number of lesbians that are at the top of business. There is Gigi Shao in Hong Kong, Shamina Singh here at MasterCard, Beth Ford, I think that is the CEO of Land O'Lakes. But you can pretty much count them on two hands, which is symptomatic of an incredible level of discrimination. So this graph is just a lot of work for me, so I put it there. I'm not really sure what it tells you. Besides, what is very interesting is that if you look at the left, you understand how colonization was the problem. As soon as colonization started, homosexuality became criminalized, and we're still working hard to roll that back. But perhaps more importantly, we have seen that. I'm careful about the way I express it, but I find that we have achieved decriminalization in the easy places, in the places where we could have those gains. And now the fight for LGBTI rights has reached the most difficult shores. The conversation is taking place in Tunisia. It's taking place, in Congo. There is an LGBT group in Congo. And so in those places, we are going to have to make so much more effort to achieve an increase in level of acceptance of LGBTI people. If you think about what happened in Nigeria when they passed the anti-homosexuality bill, I remember Ngozi, who was Minister of Finance, on TV, on CNN, reminding people that 98% of the population approved the anti-homosexuality bill. And so it came back to that idea that Sarah Kate highlighted earlier in the previous session, which is that you have to change hearts and minds. In many ways, who cares about legislation? You can decriminalize the homosexuality, but if 98% of the population continues to think you're a bunch of perverts, you're not going to go very far. And so changing hearts and minds is crucial, and that's the reason why I'm extremely passionate about bringing the private sector to do more for LGBTI rights. But I would like to pause here and tell you that criminalization of homosexuality is not such a big deal. And in many ways, when we focus so much on what's happening in Brunei or even in Chechnya, which is horrendous, right? I mean, the Sharia law in Brunei has a very negative effect on the entire sub-region, right? And then similarly, torturing, state-sponsored torture of LGBTI people in Chechnya is extremely problematic. But we have to remember that this is only the tip of the iceberg. The truth is that we have only scratched the surface of LGBTI equality in the United States. The real problem is the fact that hundreds of millions of children all around the world are going to go to bed tonight knowing that they have same-sex attraction or knowing that they have non-conforming gender identity, and yet lying to their parents and lying to their teachers and lying to their priest about it. And the damage is gigantic, right? In many ways, when we talk about diversity and inclusion in the workplace, we're only trying to repair damage that was done in school. I have two little boys, and they are 6 years old, and the idea that my boys might be hiding for me a gigantic source of anxiety, for 14 years, it's staggering. No other minority has to lie to their parents about what they are experiencing. And look at what happened in the UK when we started to talk about curriculum, about reflecting the reality of the fact that LGBTI people exist in curriculum. The backlash was gigantic. And so we should never forget, Larry Kramer, is a big idol of mine. He's a little bit crazy. But I love what he says about crumbs. We have a tendency to satisfy ourselves with crumbs. And we have to be very careful to always remind ourselves that the bar is going to get higher and higher and higher because we have endured tremendous discrimination over centuries. But I love what the person from Procter & Gamble said. We don't want any special treatment. We just want to be able to tell our parents who we are from an early age and not be afraid of their reaction. I mean, that's not too much to ask. And yet, it seems unthinkable to have that conversation in many places. So that brings me to the role of the private sector. If we have only scratched the surface of LGBTI equality, then we have a lot of work to do. And the truth is that we are losing allies. When I joined the Office of the High Commissioner in 2016, Obama was in the White House, Hillary Clinton was at the State Department, Samantha Power was the ambassador of the United States to the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon was Secretary General was Secretary General of the United Nations. I basically was on my way to get fast promotion. I was on top of the world. Let me just tell you that I'm now pretty much a minor character at the United Nations because the truth is that the United States shapes the human rights agenda. When Samantha Power would take the ambassador of Pakistan to see Rent on Broadway to explain to him the experience of LGBTI people, it was sending a message to my colleague that they would better get with the show. You say that? I don't know if you say that, but you better get on with the show, right? That you'd better, you'd better start working on LGBTI issues. Well, the current administration is not pushing for human rights of LGBTI people. In fact, they are pushing a lot for religious freedom, which at times seems to be an agenda that is going against our agenda. So we are losing key allies, not only in the United States, right? As populism and nationalism is becoming more of an issue in many countries, those countries are not going to work on human rights. So my point of view is that we have to find new allies if we want to keep the momentum of the past 50 years that we have experienced in Stonewall. And those new allies are going to be the private sector. Because the private sector, as was explaining in the previous session, is under pressure from consumers, employees, and investors to show that their brands are aligning with the values of the people that consume their products, that work for them, and that invest in their companies. And therefore, there is kind of that marriage between the need to show for companies that they are good citizens and the need of LGBTI people to achieve progress. In fact, I think that there is an urgency to social change that wasn't there when I came out. When I came out, the gayest thing you could see on TV was a little scene in Midnight Express in which, I don't know if you've seen that movie, it's a cool movie, and at some point they're in the shower and that guy approaches his hand to the chest of the other guy and the other guy pushes his hand away. That was the gayest thing on TV. I recorded it and I would play it over and over and over. Well, now, people in Tunisia, in secondary city in Tunisia, in a connected world, they have access to Rafiki or I Love Simon or Pose. You know, they can see that there is places in the world where they could leave their same-sex attraction or their non-conforming gender identity with opportunities and dignity. And so it leads to two things. One is migration, and the other one is despair. And as you know, I can tell you as a Frenchman who never managed to marry an American to get US citizenship, it's difficult. Migration is difficult. Even for people like me that are white, have some money, and barely speak English, it's difficult. It's not easy. And, you know, and in France, for the first time, we have introduced quotas on immigration. So what it says is that as migration is going to be more and more difficult for people of our community, they will have to stay in environments where they have no dignity and opportunity, while knowing that the only thing between themselves and a full life is a plane ticket. And that's extremely problematic, because you cannot tell people, it's too much to ask from people, to say, you know, don't worry, your life is going to be shitty. But in 2 generations, there will be a trans woman that will live in dignity in this country. So, you know, rest assured that you're taken care of. I mean, people want to live their life. And so in a connected world, there is an urgency for social change that didn't exist before. So this is a quote from my former boss, who also left the UN, and who was a huge champion of LGBTI rights. And it's basically this idea that not only are we asking companies to ensure that they are not discriminating against their employees, and we're asking companies to look at their supply chain, we're also asking companies to contribute to social change. You know, as the same High Commissioner said, human rights are too important to our children to be left to government alone. And I think that's key. Which is that we also personally should take a stance on human rights. So I'm not going to reiterate the business and economic case because Zachary Quinto narrated it much better than I in the previous video. And, but you know, the point is that it's not only the right thing to do, it's a good business to be inclusive of LGBTI people. And I do believe that's true. I do believe that, you know, having an entire segment of your population which potential is diminished by homophobia and transphobia is crazy. You know, in a world where there is scarce resources, you cannot afford to waste them. So those are standards of conduct that I co-wrote at the United Nations. It's actually not just that page, it's a 62-page document, but I think nobody has read it besides me. So everything is there. But I have to say that one way for me to ensure that this would not be forgotten on the website of the United Nations was to get companies to express support. And a huge number of companies in the fashion industry have expressed support for the standard. We have Procter & Gamble is a great supporter, L'Oreal, LVMH, Kering, including Gucci, H&M, Zara, Inditex. A lot of companies in the fashion industry have said, this matters to us. And what is crucial about the standard is that the first standard say, pay attention to your employees, ensure that you are empowering them to succeed. But it also says, look at your supply chain. And I think it comes back to the question that Monica asked about what B2B companies can do. What I see is that when a company like Accenture say it is a real business matter, their supply chain starts paying attention. When you are a leader and you say, it matters to us, I have witnessed that in many cases your supply chain comes along. And then the fifth standard, which is the most important to me, is act in the public sphere. And it comes back to what Procter & Gamble is doing. I love what Sarah Kate said, which is that, sometimes I go to school and I say, do you know who the High Commissioner is on Human Rights? Does anybody in the room know who the High Commissioner on Human Rights is? No. Well, nobody knows because nobody really cares. But people know who George Clooney is. When George Clooney says we should boycott the Dorchester, people start boycotting the Dorchester. And so I love what Sarah Kate said, is that brands have such an access to the people we do not have access to. And they can sway the world towards a better direction. They can counter the nationalist and populist narrative. And, I truly believe that, that brands have a key role to play. And so we published another report. That's basically what I do for a living. I publish reports. And we published another report with Open for Business called Channels of Influence, which describes the many ways companies can contribute to social change. Marketing, which we talked a lot about this morning, is only one way. There are so many other ways that companies can contribute in supporting local grassroots movement, in signing amicus brief. So we kind of outlined that, and there's nothing that makes me more pleased than to see 200 companies going to the Supreme Court and saying we will not stand for discrimination against LGBTI people. So those are examples of companies living those five standards that the United Nations set. And then, it's kind of a reminder that even though a lot of companies here can be very satisfied of progress they have made on diversity and inclusion, and I will end on this, I will tell you that it's not that great. There's no gay people in boardrooms. And very often you have a token gay guy that managed to get close enough to the CEO that then the company looks great. But in practice, I continue to see an underrepresentation of LGBTI people in business. So even in the company, there is still a lot that we can do. So thank you so much for listening to me. And now a little more TV, and then I'll respond to any questions you may have. So I love to show that video to corporations. So I told WWD, I said, I show that video to a lot of corporations, and usually everybody cries, besides bankers, because they are heartless. But, the main character is a real mother, a trans mother in India. She actually was at the launch, and her daughter is featured in the movie, and she was at the launch of our standards when I launched them in Mumbai. And I will tell you, of course, if you talk about our experience as parents, as LGBTI people, it's extremely banal, right? But you have to be able to share that experience. And what this video does is that it challenges our notion of what parenting is. If I do a video like that, it's not going to be great quality. Nobody's going to see it. If Procter & Gamble does the video, it reaches so many people, and the quality is great, and the message goes through. And so that's the power of the private sector. And to me, it's an untapped power because there is so much more that the private sector could do. So I think there's time for Q&A, right? A little bit.
Yeah.
Please.
Hi. Naomi Boria, Madam Deputy. I'd like to, thank you, Nadia. Naomi Moriyama, WWD. I'd like to be the second person to read one of your reports. Where could I find, can I find your reports online? And how, and I'd love to share with more people.
Yeah, so we have a website called unfe.org. So UNFE is for United Nations Free and Equal. And in it, we have reports, but we also have a lot of content that, we develop a lot of content targeting specific regions in the world. So as an example, in India, we have a Free and Equal campaign. We have a lot of celebrities in Bollywood that kind of take a stance. We have campaigns throughout the world that are trying to target homophobia and transphobia. So it's unfe.org. Please.
Hi. I could be wrong with my assessment, but so the UN, you guys are taking a stance against homophobia, transphobia, right? And really pushing that effort, right? Kind of. Well,
Kind of, yeah.
to an extent.
To an extent.
Where,
I mean, I always say at the United Nations, we are guests of straight people. And in most institutions, we continue to be guests of straight people. They let us sit there and they give us some crumbs, but the door can close very fast. I mean, you see it at the State Department and at USA, the development agency of the US. I think the big mistake that gay men make is that they think that acceptance of minorities is linear, right? That you only go up. But history shows you, whatever minority it is, that it always goes like that, right? And that when you think you're safe, you actually see a huge rollback on your right. So you have to be careful.
Okay. My follow-up question to that, though, is at least the UN has a stance in regards to some sort of diversity and inclusion. Why then would there then be this, why is there so much pushback then by, and this is from your perspective, why would there be so much pushback from then the United States Supreme Court, which we're big on diversity and inclusion, for the most part, we like to try and preach that, if the UN, which is an entity within government and kind of just almost as powerful as the Supreme Court, why then would there be that difference with not extending the title of, not extending Title VII, not wanting to sign that amicus brief, not wanting to put that into practice? It's like almost, do they even take into account the UN stance, seeing that like larger government entities are practicing this? It's almost like counterintuitive in some respects.
Well, I love your question. I have to say that I have never heard that the United Nations is as powerful as the Supreme Court of the United States. But I'm really flattered. One day I complained to my friend that people at CA, that's Creative Artist Agency, never return my emails. And he said, you have to understand. He said, the UN is here and CA is here. And I was like, okay, well, I get it now. I would say that, the problem with the United Nations is that it doesn't have much teeth. And it only has the power that member countries want to give it. So, what is surprising with the current administration is that it does care about the United Nations. But it does care in a very specific context, which is that it wants to push an agenda on religious freedom. It's not really interested by the human rights agenda. In fact, Secretary of State Pompeo has created a commission to redefine human rights, to align them with natural laws, whatever that means. So I would say that a lot of people in the world believe we are in a post-human rights world. They consider that human rights is, an agenda that is not really fitting the current time period we are in, that it gets in the way of pragmatic response to discontentment from people. And so they kind of are casting away human rights. My office, I think, I might be wrong, but I think the entire budget of the UN Human Rights Office is $94 million, for the entire world, which is a drop in the bucket of the entire budget of the United Nations. I think that human rights is not anymore a priority for a lot of countries. And it's very sad because I like history, and if you look at history, there is a very good reason why the world came together and created the human rights framework. It's because after the horror of World War I and World War II, we realized that left to its own device, humankind will self-destruct. How can we forget that? You know, how can we forget how many young men, sometimes 2 boys in each family, died in World War I? How can we be so short-sighted that we are now saying that this framework is unnecessary and let's move on to more pragmatic questions? So I don't think my office has that much clout in the world. I do believe the Supreme Court of the United States is very important, and sends when the United States takes very seriously human rights and takes very seriously human rights of LGBTI people, it has an effect globally. I remember Obama going to Jamaica and singling out a lesbian activist called Angeline Jackson in his speech. I mean, how courageous is that? To talk, you go to a different country and you talk about the fact that this is not a bullshit Anglo-Saxon agenda. This is one of the biggest human rights challenges of our time.
Thank you. That's all the time we have for questions.